the list.
Welcome to all of our participants. We are here today for a round table. My name is Bobby Tickner. I'm an associate professor at Valdosta State University, and I'm your host today. If you do have any questions during the round table, please add them to the question and answer box, and we'll be sure to get to those at the end of the round table. So Jaime Waters is going to be our first presenter today, and she can go ahead and share her slides.
Brilliant. Hello and welcome to our roundtable, and I've shared the wrong thing because that's obviously what I'm going to do. Okay, no, go back. Apologies, guys. I had this all set up. I've lost you. One more time. Now I've got the right one. That was the flyer for the book. This is the presentation, which is on the book. So welcome to our... There we go. Welcome to our presentation on emotional labor in criminal justice and criminology. This is a round table which we have based on our recently published book of the same name from Routledge. These are the authors that have contributed to this fantastic book, and quite a number of us are here today to talk you through some of our different chapters. So just as a really brief introduction in this panel, Chalen's going to start us off by giving us a brief introduction to emotional labor for those of you that are new to this, this field and this idea. And then we're going to go through an overview of emotional labor within some key criminal justice institutions, including police, legal profession, probation, prison, the volunteer sector, apologies, and then us researchers at the end. The aim is we're going to each give you a brief introduction to our individual areas, and we're going to try and have 10 minutes for a bit of a chat and some questions at the end. So moving swiftly on, I'm going to invite Chalen to come in and talk us through what is emotional labor.
Hi, so I'm Sharon Westaby. I'm a lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University in England, and I'm going to talk to you about what emotional labour is, which is obviously the subject of our lovely book. So emotional labour, simply put, is the management of emotion for a wage, and you can see that Hochschild is there, who defined it, who's the seminal work from her. By emotional management, we mean the management of emotion of others and themselves by a worker doing their everyday work. So a worker will have to manage their own emotions and the emotions of a targeted other in order to do their everyday job. In order for a job to include emotional labour, it must be face-to-face or voice-to-voice, although there is some new research out there at the moment which talks about a bit more online, as you can imagine. I imagine that's going to sort of burgeon as well. There must be the requirement of the management of emotions, which obviously we've talked about already, and it must be controlled in some way by the employer. So if we move on into the next slide, I will talk to you about how you do emotional labour. So these are two of the ways that you can do emotional labour, and there are others, but we'll just cover these two for now. So Hochschild highlights two particular strategies for performing emotional labour: surface and deep acting. Surface acting is where a worker does not feel the emotion that they display. So they may display a particular emotion, but inside they feel something different. While deep acting is where a worker attempts to make this feeling align with the expected emotional display, either through their imagination or by a lived experience. So if we move on again. So who sort of decides what the emotional displays are going to be then? So there are things called display rules. Hochschild called them feeling rules. Ashford and Humphrey, they call them display rules, and so I'm just going to talk about display rules, but they do overlap in some ways. Display rules are terms used by Ashford and Humphrey, and they are the rules which guide workers as to the emotions that they are expected to display in their work. There are three types. There's organisational, as you can see, rules which are to achieve the objective of the organisation. Occupational, these derived from occupational communities, their values and norms, which dictate how they're expected to use their emotions, and societal, which, as you can imagine, are the general norms of culture, which influence more specific organizational and occupational display rules. You can see the Bolton quote there, which is the idea that sometimes the balancing of she calls it feeling rules of their profession, the instrumental demands of public policy. So although there is an argument that organizational and occupational rules align, this is not always necessarily the case, and we found that particularly in our research. So if we move on, I think we're onto the actual case studies now. So I'm gonna pass you over to Sharon and Ian, who are going to talk to you about the police.
If one of us can unmute themselves anyway. Thanks everybody, happy to be here. And to the organizers, of course, our friends at Sheffield Hallam. They showed us a great time while we were over there last year, and I'm happy to be back in front of friendly faces. Today, I'll just talk a little bit about law enforcement. Police may be a little bit restrictive here. This work has encompassed 2 publications thus far, the one in the wonderful book, and then a separate one. The chapter that we submitted really focuses in on the corrections agency only. It's a large corrections agency and does include some employees who would be considered more traditionally police, street level law enforcement, but also includes personnel within the prisons, probation and parole, and administrative functions. And really, we're driven by this question set up by the fact that civilian employees in the U.S. law enforcement context make up between 1/4 and 1/3 of all employees for those organizations. And yet very little attention gets paid to them in the literature broadly and even specifically within emotional labor. This proportion rises even higher, nearly to 48% or so in corrections and sheriff's agencies. And so it's a worthy goal to begin to understand their work lives. We were set up for this question by McCarty and Scogan. They have a 2013 article that takes a wide national look at the work lives and needs of civilian employees, specifically examining emotional exhaustion, a type of burnout. And they have this really, this line that stands out for us. They say, civilians and sworn employees experience the same levels of burnout for the same reason. And that runs against our priors a bit. From coming at it from an emotional labor angle, we would expect women and men to have slightly different experiences with different types of burnout and for different reasons. So we decided to study that. Next slide, please. So we ask, is it true? Do civilian and sworn employees experience burnout at the same levels and for the same reasons? Now, McCarty and Scogan are looking at burnout as predicted by organizational factors and sort of broader demographic factors, where how large an agency is, where it's located, that sort of thing. And so we are taking on a different angle of it. But the short answer is no. We find that actually sworn and civilian employees experience different levels of burnout, and we examine both emotional and exhaustion and depersonalization, and they experience those levels, those differing levels, for different reasons. Primarily, we find that the sworn employees report significantly higher levels of both types of burnout, both emotional exhaustion and depersonalization. Now, though they are experiencing them at different levels, meaning sworn officers are reporting higher levels of both types of burnout, surface acting as a predictor of burnout is consistent across both groups. And I left off some text, so that's my fault here. But the big point here is that surface acting has nearly twice as much of an effect within the civilian employee group as for the sworn group. And that generally within the civilian group, their burnout is being explained by just a few predictors, whereas it's much more complex picture on the sworn side. And that this runs somewhat counter to what we would expect necessarily, because the civilian and sworn populations are also heavily sex divided. So the civilian side is mainly women and the sworn side is mainly men. And previous research tells us that men should experience higher levels of depersonalization compared to women, whereas women would tend to report higher levels of emotional exhaustion. As far as display rules, one interesting finding we had was somewhat of a null finding. Display rules simply weren't significant predictors of burnout in civilian employees. And we don't know exactly why that is. In the next slide, I'll go into some future questions that we're trying to answer. But it was interesting that the sworn population, which has been traditionally more studied within the emotional labor literature, we had a pretty good idea of the model going on there. But in the civilian population, we don't. So it's just a call for a little more research there. Next slide, please. So as usual, we generated more questions than answers necessarily. The gender dimension here is particularly compelling. In our population of the corrections agency, the sworn civilians were about 86% male and the civilians were about 67% female. This begs the question, like, is there a gendered component to women working in a traditionally male profession, but also a male gendered institution? And so we do need more intersectional research in this area. And in some new work that's still under review from Sharon, myself, and Jen Seelig, we ask this question: are women in sworn positions experiencing somewhat different emotional labor demand and outcomes compared to males in civilian positions? Because again, the literature would tell us that those in the minority sex position should be experiencing higher levels of emotional labor demand. And in fact, what we find is that males in the civilian positions do not. And this lends some evidence towards the idea that there are institutional emotional labor demands that are at play here. So once again, thank you very much. Sharon, my co-author, is here as well. Sharon, if you had anything to add, I would welcome it.
I don't have anything to add, but I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Brilliant. So that was a bit of a law enforcement from the United States perspective. And we now have Alex Black, also from Sheffield Hallam, who's going to be talking about the police as well.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Yes, so I'm Alex Black from Sheffield Hallam University also, and I'm interested in emotional labour within policing, and the work that I'll just talk about now, I did with a colleague, Karen Lumsden at Nottingham University, and we were looking at emotional labour at play in emergency police call centres, so 999, 101 call centres that are a mix of call takers and also dispatch officers. And actually they're mainly civilian staff within the call centre, mixed gender, but predominantly civilian staff, although there are also police officers in there as well. And call centres in the literature are very often referred to as a kind of a police boundary. So people like Manning have referred to call centres as the sort of the boundary which determines what is and what isn't police work. So it's a kind of a mesh where non-police related incidents can be sort of filtered out. So they have a hand in defining what the work of the organisation is to some extent. And one of the things we were interested in, with that in mind, I suppose, is the sort of social organisation of policing. And I guess by this, I mean some of the stresses that sit within the structure of the organisation itself. So we were looking at issues of kind of austerity, cutbacks, particularly to some of the broader police families, such as social services, mental health services, some of the organisational changes around sort of risk and risk management and risk aversion. And this was kind of important to us because job satisfaction, personal accomplishment, some of these things that might counter the effect of emotional labour, like emotional exhaustion and burnout, are tied to these organisational stresses. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we saw in terms of emotional labour, I'll just kind of highlight some specific things. There were clear display rules within the call centre that prioritised neutrality and calmness when on a call. So this was the kind of preferred display rule. And this was obviously a source of tension and frustration with the call takers when they were on a call, particularly when the caller didn't follow what was seen as kind of expected, the expected script of the call. So when the caller perhaps wasn't given the necessary information for the call taker to grade the call and pass it through to dispatch in a kind of a timely way, or if the caller was overly emotional or angry or not cooperating particularly, the call taker would kind of try and remain calm within this context, and they would talk about the need to remain calm and the frustrations and the challenges, and they kind of talk about who was better at being calm in those situations and who wasn't very good at being calm. But also at the same time, there were these kinds of coping mechanisms or coping techniques where the callers would kind of play up their calmness to other people in the room as a bit of a joke and a kind of to sort of lighten that tension. So one of the common tropes was that when they would speak to a caller, they would ask them where they were, hoping to get a kind of a geographical location. And the caller would say something like, oh, I'm at my mum's house, or I'm at home, or I'm at my friend's. And the call taker obviously wouldn't know where that was and would kind of do a big deep in-breath and say, okay, and where is your mum's house? And, roll their eyes, and, others would sort of laugh and try and diffuse some of that tension. So there's kind of typical example there of a sort of a mismatch between the expectation of the caller and the call handler. But in contrast, when the call involved a more typical kind of law and order obvious emergency situation, that calmness was sort of necessary and required in order to kind of have a job well done and to meet the needs of the call. So that was seen as a kind of a more rewarding call. So there was a distinction there between the neutrality that was surface acting and the neutrality that was deep acting. But one of the kind of key things in our study was the kind of idea that when trying to remain calm, often the frustration wasn't necessarily the caller, but the frustration was that some of the calls that were being put through the call takers didn't see as police work. So there was this kind of renegotiation of the boundary of police work in terms of what should and shouldn't be passed through. Some of the calls were not seen as proper criminal offences, low-level offences, or they were responses to kind of prior critical incidents that the force themselves were now kind of critically aware of, making sure they resolved properly. There was this renegotiation of that police boundary. There's a lot of discussion about why are we doing this, we shouldn't be doing this. And there was a kind of an obvious then sort of value dissonance between the values of the organisation and the values of the individuals within it. And this value dissonance can exacerbate burnout and emotional exhaustion and reduce some of that personal accomplishment and job satisfaction. And there were other ways of managing that, other ways of kind of collective communities of coping and kind of humour and using sort of managerial techniques to kind of mock up, how stressed are you today, techniques to try and kind of reduce some of that tension. I won't say any more about that because I think I've used my time. But I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Alex. So from the police, we're going to move on to having a look at the legal profession. And for this, we have Shalen Westaby and Andrea Subryan, both from, again, Sheffield Hallam University.
Hi. So I'm going to talk about Andrea's case study. So I'm not involved in this, but I did write some of the chapter with her. So I'm going to talk about Andrea, basically, just, So while traditionally emotions have been marginalised in legal practice, it's undeniable that legal professionals are expected to engage in emotional labour as part of their everyday work. Andrea's study of family law practitioners in the UK explores this particular area of emotional labour, particularly. But she does talk more about emotional labour in terms of display rule conflict. And so this is the diagram here, which is effectively the multiple roles, the multiple work roles of FLPs, as you can see in the middle, or family law practitioners, sorry, we say it like that because it's such a long thing to say, which are expected through client display rules, professional display rules, and organisational display rules. It's the adherence to this often conflicting expectations which can result in both inter and intra display rule conflict. So if we move on to the next slide, please, Jaime. So in terms of intra-display rule conflict, this is where there is a conflict between two display rules, but within one of those sort of those particular types of display rule. Sorry, I do need to cough, I apologize. Sorry about that. And an example of intra-display rule conflict can be seen through Matt's comments about these organizational display rules. In fact, his immediate line manager expected him to emotionally support the client, while his department manager, who worked at the headquarters, didn't see any need for any kind of discussion of emotions at work. So he didn't really see any need to kind of impart any kind of emotional support to the client. So within one organization there, you've got display rule conflict. You've got two different types of expectation of emotional displays, and so they conflict. And of course, that means that the employee, the worker, has to kind of decide which one to prioritize. We've then got inter-display rule conflict, and this is where two or more display rules from the different groups within that diagram that we showed you conflict with each other. An example can be seen, which is explained by Jason, and there we see a conflict between organizational display rules and client display rules. While the firm has a particular expectation of the legal practitioner in terms of the emotions they display, the client has a contrasting position there. So it's the idea that basically a client will expect you to display particular emotional displays, sorry. And the organization will then expect you to display contrary emotional displays. And again, you get this conflict, but this is between two different display rules. So therefore it's called inter-display rule conflict. So can we move on to the next slide, please, Jamie? So Andrea's participants highlighted a number of consequences in terms of display rule conflict, ranging from discomfort to professional identity conflict. Most participants highlighted the pressure or stress they felt at having to prioritize one display rule over another. And at least one particular participant, Emily, raised that her mental health suffered as a result of having to do this, having to sort of juggle these different display rule expectations. And as a result, she had no choice but to leave the profession. So obviously that's quite a brief consequences. Obviously that's developed further in the case study, but obviously that we haven't got much time. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about coping with display rule conflict. This is one of the particularly interesting findings in Andrea's work. So all participants in Andrea's study discussed the importance of communities of coping. And that's one particular informal networking kind of one informal way of coping with this particular type of consequence of emotional labour. These are sort of informal support networks created at work. However, interestingly, in the family law practitioner sort of arena field, if you will, it was found, Andrea found, sorry, that participants limited the amount and the content they offloaded to peers due to the need to present a positive image of themselves. So although we have got this informal community of coping where you do offload some of that sort of stress and anxiety that's created by display rule conflict, as you can see from Emily here, you know, she would limit it. She would limit it because she needed to project a particular image in that field. Within law and family law, there is a particular expectation to be competitive, to be, you know, to be good, basically, and to not actually kind of show any kind of weakness. And so this is one of the interesting findings here. And so this would demonstrate that they were a competent practitioner. And so I think that Andrea is interested in developing that further and thinking about that particularly in that field of study. So thank you very much. I'll move you on to probation with Andrew.
Thanks, Chalen. I think I've managed to unmute myself. This is looking at probation and emotional labour in England and Wales. And that's where really myself, Jake Phillips and Chalen Westaby started thinking about emotional labour. I guess I was going to talk about kind of marginalisation, persistence and impact of emotional labour in probation practice. In broad brushstrokes, thinking about the marginalization of emotion, we argue that sort of between the 80s and 90s and 2000s, there was a shift in public policy as a result of unease about the effectiveness of probation practice and being perceived as too soft. And this kind of happened in a sort of neoliberal context where justice services were kind of focusing on economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. There was a severing of probation qualification from social work, new national standards prioritizing enforcement over compliance, and a risk-need responsivity model where the use of emotions wasn't really explicit. It also kind of, we saw rehabilitation conceptualized from a utilitarian perspective, expressed as managerialism rather than welfare, or a more expressive form of rehabilitation, which prioritized effective risk management, objectivity, and rationality over feeling. All of these have an impact on how practitioners perform emotional labor and shape organizational display rules. Having said that, thinking about the persistence of emotions in probation practice, what happens in policies rarely neatly reflected in what happens on the ground in practice. And there were some significant studies such as Sue Rex's study looking at probation practitioners and people on probation. And in that study, Rex recognized the importance of listening empathetically, the role of empathy in building constructive relationships. There's also Chris Trotter's work, which recognized the role of empathy in lowering recidivism rates. And also, importantly, particularly to us, because we build a lot on Charlotte Knight's work, Charlotte Knight talked about the invisible world of emotion and the importance of emotional literacy. So our work kind of builds on Knight's to show how probation officers manage emotion, the consequences, and how it's important to discussions about effective practice. So for example, when we did our first research with probation officers, we found examples of surface acting where people were not displaying a feeling that could harm the openness in a relationship because it might inhibit the sharing of information for risk assessment. We also found examples of deep acting when practitioners expressed happiness when they were supervising someone who was doing well. And that really is a cornerstone of probation values in terms of the belief in the capacity of people to change. Tidmarsh, more recently in 2020, talks about professionalization in emotional labor and looks at privatized probation workers. And he identified the intuitive way practitioners knew what was appropriate and inappropriate feelings to display. We also looked at the role of emotion in building a relationship and skills for effective engagement, delivery, and supervision, which thankfully has been shortened to SEEDS. And emotional labor reveals much of the complex work involved in building relationships with people on probation. In terms of the impact of emotional labor on probation practitioners, emotional labor for us reveals that sense of the probation worker as a kind of historical bricolage of social work, counseling, psychology, psychotherapy, adapting to the penal welfare complex. It's clear that probation work involves emotional labor, and we would argue this emotional endeavor by POs or probation officers fits with Steinberg's model of human relations at the most complex level. Probation officers are using interpersonal skills to create a climate for welfare to clients, coaching, guiding through attitudinal behavioral change around sensitive and controversial issues, and sometimes there can be resistance, but also providing comfort and reassurance when people are angry, grieving, experiencing trauma, or distraught. So we'd also map on this this onto Steinberg's model in terms of the highest level of effort on the part of probation workers who deal with people who can be unpredictable in unpredictable circumstances, where there could be someone who poses a risk or danger, and they also have to meet the needs of this same group. So we do think there's further work to be done around burnout in relation to this complex, emotionally demanding occupation. And in previous studies, participants have talked about the relentless nature of the work. Jamie, next slide, please. So in summary, we found there's a lack of knowledge about emotional labor in probation practice. And other than Knight and Tidmarsh's work, there's little work on emotion, which is surprising given the enduring nature of emotion in probation work. But an encouraging sign is the recognition of the importance of emotional labor in the new supervisory line management framework being implemented by the National Probation Service, which we've been asked to evaluate. So hopefully we can share the findings in person next time, maybe somewhere hot and sunny would be my request. But I'll pass on to the next person, who is, oh, it's prison. So that'll be Joe.
Classic unmuting issue there. Apologies for that. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Jamie, and the organisers for having me. I'm going to speak today about, on behalf of myself and my co-author, Aoife Waters, who can't make it today, about prisons and emotional labour, but specifically shifting the focus a little bit to the emotional labour and emotionality of conducting prison research. So we feel that the emotional labour and prisons have received much welcome attention in recent years, but perhaps not the researcher side of it. And this is an area that graduate students and certainly early career researchers maybe do not appreciate until they're in the thick of it, if you will. So they are already engaging in researching emotionally laden issues and engaging in emotional labour, but have not really factored that in to their research plans and methodologies. So we argue that this should be acknowledged as a legitimate part of the research process, but also that allows for preparation, the training, and the theorizing of engaging in this kind of research. And we feel that this is beneficial, not just in terms of reflexively contextualizing the role of emotionality in the collection, co-generation, and analysis of the data. Next slide, please. So we all obviously have our certain roots and biographies that we bring to our research, but in our particular case, we came to engaging and being more cognizant of emotional labour through different but also convergent routes. Emotional labour in my study of prison officers' occupational cultures and identities was part of the research focus. Aoife, who was researching the disciplinary systems in Irish prisons and gender, came to it from a previous work with the Inspector of Prisons in Ireland and felt that she was relatively comfortable with the environment, but encountered difficulties in various ways along the way. So of course, engaging in prison research, you're highly likely to encounter highly emotional, highly charged scenarios where emotional labour is part of the part of your everyday life. But Aoife engaged with this in a particularly traumatic way, where after a day of interviews and months of rumours of particularly nasty emotional and physical abuse of a prisoner, 3 interviewees confirmed in graphic detail these to be true to her, and she realised that she had also interviewed the alleged perpetrators in recent weeks. So the emotional labour involved in the feeling rules of being a researcher and demonstrating compassion for your participants, but also being professional, really challenged her. And in the aftermath, she felt, as she said in the paper, haunted by this experience, haunted by the futility and the guilt of conducting research when people were suffering in a real way. She was, to use Yoon's phrase, emotionally paralyzed. And while that is incredibly extreme, some of the examples I discuss in the papers were almost the other end of the spectrum, whereby the potential for something dramatic happened. I was on a prison wing and I felt a gut feeling that the atmosphere was changing. I was basing it on my research thus far, but I also was very conscious of the feeling rules that were incumbent on me as a researcher, that I wanted to be seen to be able to handle the prison environment, not to be seen in any negative way by the officers that I was trying to research. But I ended up acknowledging and recognizing that, as Liebling said, emotions constitute data, and that we engage in this strategy in order to benefit our research. So I decided to act. And on the final slide, I'll just conclude by saying that we argue in this way that recognizing that the emotionality and emotional labor that we do as prison researchers needs to be part of our methodology, needs to be part of our support and training. We train people to do coding and interviews, but we don't train them to do emotional labor in a sense. And to agree with Ben Crew when he said that the research isn't about us, this isn't about navel gazing, but the research is conducted by us. and we are the primary instrument of research. So we feel that this is ultimately something that will benefit us and the research in general. So I'll finish with that and hand over to the next speaker. Thanks very much.
Oh, thanks very much, Joe. Our next speakers are Kaitlyn, Quinn from the University of Toronto, and Philippa, whose name I'm going to mess up, so I'm not going to say, from the University of Nottingham, who are going to speak to us about the voluntary sector. And apologies, Philippa.
That's okay, Philippa's not here anyway. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here and very grateful to be included in this book. Philippa and I contributed a chapter on emotional labor in the penal voluntary sector. There's a definition here on the slide. I'm going to skip a few things in the interest of time and respect for the presenters that come after me. The data that we presented in this chapter were drawn from two separate qualitative research projects undertaken in England and Canada that center the experiences of volunteers and paid staff at voluntary organizations. So, I guess this is a different slide anyway. At the individual level, the focus of PVS work for those that we spoke to was cultivating relationships with criminalized service users on the basis of empathy and genuine interest. So we were told it was important for volunteers to connect with service users on a feeling level, and volunteers were required to demonstrate that they could relate to the feelings that clients were describing by carefully managing their own emotions. So they engaged in deep acting by putting themselves in service users' shoes and imagining what they would do in that situation. So in this context, the experience of the emotions rather than simply the performance was vital. Now, despite a meta-narrative of volunteers' authentic emotional connections with service users, organizations carefully controlled the conditions under which these relationships were formed. So when speaking to service users, volunteers were instructed to smile and gesture appropriately, nod, lean towards service users, be alert, maintain eye contact, and be attentive to their physical proximity. They were told to match service users' softness or loudness of speech and their speed of talking to mirror the mood that they were in. So recognizing the complexity of suppressing spontaneous emotional reactions in stressful real-time interactions with service users, PVS organizations encouraged volunteers to memorize and internalize scripted responses. So they were provided with handouts containing hair-splitting detail about the kinds of practices and language that should be used when interacting with service users. Next slide, please. So on this slide are some examples of the kinds of practices and phrases that were either discouraged or encouraged by one PVS organization where I conducted fieldwork. Now, despite the specificity of these materials, volunteers sometimes received contradictory messages about what was expected from them. For example, a central tension emerged between the expectation that volunteers form genuine connections with service users and the rigid channels through which they were permitted to engage in these relationships. Therefore, it was not simply that volunteers must feel through deep acting or perform through surface acting, but they had to navigate the sometimes fraught relationship between these demands. And now the other part of our chapter deals with the criminal justice system and the relationship that actors in the PVS had to maintain with probation officers and other members of the criminal justice system. I'm going to skip that right now just because I see time. So all in all, our data support existing studies of emotional labor that highlight both the importance of deep and surface acting, yet we also encourage scholars to consider the boundaries between these different forms of emotional labors as often blurry or unstable and sometimes tense and contradictory. That's all for me. Thank you.
There's a little less than 10 minutes left.
Right. Well, I'm just going to come in very quickly at the end and we might get 5 minutes. I'm not even sure how questions work on this, but if I speak really quickly, we might have 5 minutes to discover how questions work on this. Myself, Chalen, Andrew, and Jake, who are also from the probation slides, we joined up and did some research on the researchers. And I love that Joe mentioned the navel gazing because, you know, as researchers, we do love to do a little bit of narcissistic or not so narcissistic navel gazing. But we wanted to look at the emotional labor that we as criminological researchers perform in our lives of researching other people. this is just a little bit on our methodology, but I'm just going to skip to a few of our key findings. And it was just to say that generally our participants, who are all criminological researchers, self-selected either as a criminologist or self-selected that their subject was criminological of some description. But we found that a lot of our researchers felt a lot of sort of empathy and a lot of genuine emotion for their participants. There was also a lot of suppression of emotion and deep acting, particularly, and Joe gave some brilliant examples of this, of when you hear some really horrible things when you're doing the research, and the fact and the suppression that goes on around that. And just to mention everyone's favorite imposter syndrome, and how we all feel when we go into a lot of these research situations that we're going to be found out, and they're going to figure out that maybe we're not really real researchers, or we don't really know what we're talking about. Some of the consequences then of performing this emotional labor were things like feeling overwhelmed, and huge feelings of guilt. A lot of our participants spoke about the fact that a lot of these situations, a lot of the ethnographic participants in particular, that they could leave these environments, but their participants, the people they were working with, had to stay in sometimes awful, abusive, violent situations. And that sense of guilt of us as researchers, if we go into a situation and we get to leave that situation. And alongside that, those feelings of anger and disgust, frustration, sadness, resentment around a lot of those situations. But also, and a lot of those are quite negative emotions, but that we found a lot of people also feel very positive emotions. And that a lot of criminological researchers, a lot of us feel a huge amount of responsibility towards our participants. And that feeling of wanting to give a voice to our participants and do justice to our participants, and how a lot of us will also sort of go out of our way, often above and beyond, to do that, especially again if we feel that our participants are vulnerable, and sort of don't have a voice otherwise. And then the last thing, just to touch on really quickly, is just some of the coping mechanisms that some of the researchers, that a lot of the researchers spoke about. So things around self-care, so looking after themselves, a lot of talk around changing clothes and having showers. Again, a lot of the ethnographers, a lot of the prison ethnographers talking about sort of that changing and that moving of space, which also led into that space creation. So physical space and mental space, but moving away from the field of research, but also creating mental space by, reading trashy novels, watching trashy telly, playing violent video games, just sort of anything to give them that space. And then finally, the communities of coping, so coming together with other researchers. And the last thing I will just echo was Joe's comments as well, that we found is this call for more training, more thought into the emotional labor of doing research, and how we're trained to do data analysis and we're trained to do data collection, but we aren't trained to sort of in the emotional labor of doing and experiencing that research. So that was our research on criminological researchers. I think, is our moderator here? Are we on to 3 minutes for discussion?
I am here. We've got just a few minutes to have some questions. If you look down, there's a Q&A option at the bottom, and it'll have the questions listed there. If you can't see it, I'm happy to read them for you. But you can go ahead and stop sharing.
Oh, can I stop sharing? Oh, right. I was going to say, just before I finish sharing, I don't know if I've done this wrong.
Oh, you can leave that up if you'd like.
Can I leave that up?
Sure.
Where's my Q&A?
If you don't have it, I can read at least the first one. This is for Kaitlyn. You can reflect on the fact that your participants were volunteers, how that might modulate EL, given the original definition is about having a wage.
Sure. So yeah, emotional labor is typically something that's invoked when people are paid employees. So the case is a bit different. We did interview and conduct field work with some volunteers and some paid work. The examples I mainly talked about today were volunteers. And this was because emotions and emotional labor formed a huge part of how volunteers were trained at the particular organization where I was conducting fieldwork. So I think that there are certainly some differences in volunteers versus paid staff, but I think sort of the takeaway from our research with that is that emotional labor is something that is still, it is very relevant for volunteers, and volunteers took this position very seriously. They often were there weekly for a year. They signed employment contracts. They had particular behavioral expectations. So in some ways, though there wasn't a wage, it did, these experiences did take on a number of qualities of paid employment.
Great. And this next question is for Alex Black. You mentioned inverting managerial tools in call rooms. I wasn't clear what you meant by this. Are you using existing tools and scales or making your own?
Yeah, so the example I was referring to that we saw in the call center was a kind of a one that they'd made themselves, that they'd created this scale of little Kanye West heads from when he had a kind of a severe breakdown to when he's feeling peak Kanye West, and they were kind of asking to rate each other, how Kanye West they were feeling, and that's the example we used in the book. So they were kind of mocking the managerial tools to sort of self-assess each other and asking each other to kind of rate themselves in a kind of a stress management way tool.
Great. Are there any other questions from our participants or attendees? No? Well, I would just personally like to say thank you. I'm actually a prison researcher myself, so I appreciated hearing some of the work you've done in that area. On behalf of the CrimCon board, just want to say thank you all for coming, both the attendees and our panelists. This was a very interesting roundtable. The information is listed there if you'd like to contact any of our panelists, and I appreciate everyone coming today.
Thank you very much. And yes, I've just put us as the editors of the book on there. Obviously, we're all Googleable, but if you email one of us, we'll pass you on to the relevant person.
Great. Thank you again to our panelists. We really appreciate you telling us more about your book today.
Thank you very much for having us. And thanks, CrimCon, for organizing an awesome event.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers.